A violin string hums in the dark, taut, trembling, and about to snap. In the hush between notes, someone rewrites a symphony not with ink, but with vengeance. When music becomes motive and silence becomes threat, the stage is set not for a concert, but for murder. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Settle in, because this mystery begins now. I'm not what you'd call a sunrise enthusiast, especially on days when it hasn't finished rising yet, but I happened to be up, don't ask why, and opened the front door of the brownstone just after 6:40 a.m., expecting maybe a sluggish paperboy or a misplaced milk bottle. What I found was a violin case, black, battered, and split, along one edge like it had taken a bad fall from a tall stool. There was no note tucked under the handle. I'm not that lucky. It was inside, resting neatly beside the broken bridge of the instrument. A standard sheet of white typing paper, no creases, no smudges, just a line of text, centered and stark. He deserves to die like I did. No signature, no hint of the he in question. But the case smelled of something besides wood glue and varnish. A faint trace of perfume, cheap, floral, and a dab of rosin behind it, like an afterthought. I closed the door gently. Wolfe would still be in bed unless the eggs were ready. But even he might raise an eyebrow at this kind of early morning symphony. When Nero Wolfe finally made his descent, by which I mean the slow and padded migration from his bedroom to the breakfast table, I laid the violin and the note on the table beside his eggs. Not on his plate. I'm reckless, not suicidal. He didn't even blink. "Remove that," he said, flicking his hand at the broken instrument as if it were an offensive pimento. "It is a dead object," I obliged, setting it on the sideboard. Then I read the note aloud. Wolfe sighed. Dramatic, melodramatic, possibly female, certainly overwrought. He buttered his toast with the precision of a man dissecting a small mammal. "Archie, if I allowed every anonymous threat or poetic grudge to distract me from my food, I would expire of indigestion by Thursday." "But this one came with props," I pointed out, "and a distinct smell of regret." "Regret," Wolfe muttered, "is an unstable perfume. It evaporates quickly." He returned to his eggs. That, in Wolfian diplomacy, meant case dismissed. I pocketed the note. Something told me we hadn't heard the last of it. I spent the better part of the morning reacquainting myself with the elegant underworld of Manhattan's musical rental houses. Shops with dusty corners and customer ledgers, still written in fountain pen, usually by old men with bushy eyebrows and opinions on Schumann. It was the second stop on East 77th that got me a match. The proprietor, a Mr. Wallach with fingers like drumsticks and a memory that could embarrass a tax auditor, recognized the case immediately. "That went out 2 weeks ago," he said. "Young woman. Check, I think. Very precise about her rosin. Paid cash." He flipped through his ledger and pointed. "Carla Ruzicka." The name looked like a typo, but I made a note. Wallach gave me an address which I appreciated, a walk-up near Carnegie Hall. Fitting, I suppose. I headed over, wondering what kind of woman rents a violin, abandons it on a detective's doorstep, and signs her threats with second-hand perfume and a martyr complex. She answered the buzzer on the second ring, and her voice, even through the static, had the clipped edge of someone who didn't trust strangers or mornings. "You are?" she asked. I told her. There was a pause, then the door clicked open. She was younger than I expected, early 30s at most, but her eyes had seen things she hadn't yet forgiven. Slender, pale, and tightly strung, not unlike the instrument she claimed not to know anything about. "I did not leave a violin," she said, arms crossed. Her accent tucked every syllable into a stiff collar. "And I certainly did not write a note." I told her I hadn't accused her. Yet. She relented enough to invite me in. A clean, sparse apartment, one window cracked open to let in more traffic than breeze. A stand of sheet music sat next to an open case on the floor, not the one I'd brought. This violin looked older, better kept, and well used. When I mentioned the note's wording, her face changed. Not much, but enough. A flicker of something old and bruised. "Someone wants attention," she said, "or sympathy, or revenge." She didn't answer that, but her hands gripped her elbows tightly, like she was bracing against a draft only she could feel. I didn't press, not yet, but I wasn't leaving empty-handed. It took 3 careful questions and 1 uncomfortable silence before she said his name. "Anton Vrana," she murmured. "You will not know it, but once he played Mendelssohn better than anyone I ever heard." She walked to her bookshelf and touched a cracked spine, a concert program folded between the pages. "He was destroyed," she said, "by lies, by a man who wanted his place." "Destroyed how?" "By public accusation, by disgrace, and then a boat." "A boat?" She nodded. "Lake Garda. They said it was an accident." Her voice said otherwise. I asked if the note could be from someone who loved Vrana or hated him. She didn't answer directly, just looked at me and said, "He was not the kind to forget." I left her standing there, next to the shelf, half certain I'd just met someone who either feared a ghost or was preparing to become one. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was already in the plant room, which meant conversation was forbidden unless someone had died or Fritz had burned the lamb. I had a feeling we were headed for both. Back at the brownstone, I found Wolfe precisely where I had left him, which was not a feat of tracking, but a law of physics. The man was stationary by nature, not from sloth, but from a conviction that the world ought to come to him, and usually did. I gave him the rundown on Miss Ruzicka, the perfume on the violin, and the name Anton Vrana. When I finished, he closed his eyes, inhaled through his nose, as if the name itself carried a stench, and said, poisonously Slavic, murky with sentiment, an overbrewed infusion of guilt and violin strings. Which means, "It means, Archie, that I shall not sully my intellect with bohemian phantoms, unless someone has paid, died, or eaten improperly. Do not disturb me further with it." He picked up his book. I picked up the paper. It was the second page of the Gazette, lower left corner, and yet it landed like a cymbal crash. "Music critic found strangled with violin string," the headline declared. Tidy, restrained, and unpleasantly specific. The victim, Simon Bright, acclaimed, feared, insufferable. Known for slicing careers with a few keystrokes and praising no one unless they were recently deceased or safely obscure. I read the piece aloud. Wolfe continued chewing his toast. "No sign of forced entry," I said. "No witnesses. But someone knew he'd be alone." Wolfe flicked his eyes toward me without lifting his head. "A man who makes his living ridiculing the sincere will eventually find sincerity returned in blood." I folded the paper. "You may want to reconsider your stance on bohemian phantoms." He didn't answer. Instead, he reached for his second egg with unnecessary deliberation, the Wolffian equivalent of a raised eyebrow. I knew that look. He was annoyed, not by me, by the case, or rather the fact that it had crossed the boundary from theatrical to corporeal. And when something passes from symbol to corpse, Wolfe starts thinking, whether he admits it or not. It was well after 7 when the bell rang, and I opened the door to find Carla Ruzicka standing in the vestibule, hair damp, eyes raw, and a tremor in her hands that suggested she'd either been running or unraveling. I didn't ask which, I just let her in. She followed me silently into the office, where Wolfe was seated behind his desk in a state of suspicious repose, the kind that comes right before a verbal ambush. Carla took the chair opposite him, but didn't sit. She stood clutching her bag like a weapon and said, "He's back." Wolfe tilted his head, a slow, indulgent gesture. "Who is back, madam?" "Anton Vrana," she said. "He's not dead. I saw him 2 nights ago. He watched me play." That did it. Wolfe shifted, not far, not fast, but enough to betray interest. "I presume," he said, "you are not prone to hallucinations?" "I know his face," she said, "and I know what fear feels like." Wolfe exhaled slowly, like a man acknowledging the presence of something unpleasant, but worthy of thought. I had a feeling breakfast was about to be disrupted for several days. She told it like someone scraping frost off glass, carefully, and with hands that didn't quite stop shaking. We were seated in the office, and Wolfe, having acquiesced to the presence of a woman in distress without requesting her immediate removal, listened with an expression that passed for attention in his private glossary. "Anton was," Carla began, "a violinist of terrifying ability. He made other men look like typists, but he wasn't diplomatic. He played like the world owed him its silence." "Was he owed anything else?" Wolfe inquired. She hesitated. "Simon Bright didn't think so. He wrote that Anton had stolen themes from a dead Czech composer, that his concerto was a forgery. The paper printed it, and then the others did. Overnight, Anton became a fraud." Wolfe let out a breath through his nose. I watched his fingers twitch, a minor tremor reserved for verbal incompetence. Carla went on. "Anton left for Europe. There was a letter from Lake Garda. He said he needed stillness. Then, nothing. A week later, the boat he rented was found overturned. No body. A musician without applause," Wolfe murmured, "becomes a ghost faster than most. And this ghost," Carla said, her voice dropping, "has come home." "I saw him," she said, and didn't blink. Wolfe tilted his head. "You saw a man you believe was Anton Vrana?" "No," she said. "I saw Anton. I admit I've heard conviction in people's voices before, usually just before a bad decision. But this was different. Carla Ruzicka was not the dramatic type. Her manner was clipped, and her gaze wasn't hunting for sympathy. "He was watching us rehearse," she said. At the hall, he stood in the upper gallery behind the glass. "It's one way. You can't see through unless you know where to look." "How can you be sure it was him?" I asked. "There's a way Anton stands," she said. "His left shoulder tips when he breathes. And his hands. The left fingers never fully straighten. The war did that." Wolfe narrowed his eyes. If a man is thought dead and seen alive, one must ask, who benefits by his resurrection? Carla didn't answer. But the look in her eyes said she'd already begun asking that question, and hadn't liked the answers she'd come up with. I took a trip downtown and convinced a young officer with too much ambition and not enough facial hair to let me into Simon Bright's apartment. It wasn't hard. All I had to do was look appropriately unimpressed by crime scene tape and mispronounce Stravinsky. The place was tidy, monastic, really. A metronome ticked on the mantel. Someone had forgotten to turn it off, or someone had wanted it heard. There was no sign of struggle, no broken furniture, not even a misplaced book, except for the string, one violin string, waxed, gut, pulled tight and snipped near the bridge, still holding a faint kink in its middle, the memory of a throat. I'd seen cleaner murders, but not many that had been composed so deliberately. There was a faint print on the knob of the front door. Partial, probably useless. But the latch itself bore no signs of tampering. Whoever came in had been expected. I left the apartment with nothing but a note in my pad and an unpleasant impression, not of violence, but of choreography. Someone had taken a bowstring and turned it into punctuation. If Simon Bright's death was a tragedy to the city's culture columnists, it was an ulcer to Inspector Kramer, and when he arrived at the brownstone the next morning, he looked like someone had swapped his cigar for a lit fuse. "She had motive," he barked, referring to Carla. "She had public cause. She yelled at him last week at Carnegie in front of a dozen witnesses, and now he's dead." "She also," I said, "plays in a string quartet that rehearsed all night. There's a room full of alibis." "Convenient," Kramer growled. "So's murder." Wolfe didn't rise. He rarely does. But he did speak, which, with Wolfe, often costs more. Inspector, if you intend to pursue the lady out of irritation rather than evidence, I suggest you take a vacation first. You'll save the city money and yourself embarrassment. Kramer's face darkened. You're not involved, Wolfe. Don't try to be. I'm not trying, Wolfe said, reaching for his beer. I am merely succeeding at being uninvolved with flair. It was a solid dismissal, but I noticed the way Wolfe's thumb paused on the rim of the bottle, just long enough to say, keep digging. By the time I returned from a failed attempt to speak with Bright's editor, who'd barricaded himself behind deadlines, and a secretary with the charm of a stapler, Wolfe had commandeered the living room and was reading aloud from Bright's final published review. The piece, titled Elegy Without Country, is a lament not for the dead, but for the dishonest. Its notes belong not to the composer, but to the grave he pilfered them from, Wolfe intoned. What we hear is not music, but a resurrection with no soul. He closed the page with a distasteful flick. Subtle, I said. Subtle as a tax demand, Wolfe replied. Note the initials. J.V., Julian Vrana? Wolfe nodded once. It is not just a bad review, it is a public accusation. Veiled, but unmistakable, and likely deliberate. Deliberate enough to get him killed? Wolfe looked at me as if I had asked whether bees sting. Art is the one battlefield, he said, where character assassination is considered criticism. He tapped the paper once, then let it fall. And like all wars, he added, the bodies eventually become real. Wolfe called it the natural reduction, which was his way of saying that every human gathering eventually distilled itself into a smaller, smellier subset of suspects. It was after lunch, which had included guinea hen braised in Armagnac, and a short discourse on the superiority of Turkish figs, when he sat back in his chair, narrowed his eyes, and began listing them like sins on a scroll. First, he said, the emotional fulcrum. Carla Ruzicka. I nodded. Scorned, dramatic, possibly unstable. She is a musician, Wolfe countered. The instability is axiomatic. Next, Leo Torin. A critic who wrote less than Bright but hated him twice as much. Wolfe inclined his head. His career is stained with accusations of plagiarism by proxy. If Bright had evidence, that could be motive. I jotted it down. And then? Sophie Bellman, he said. Bright's former wife, current manager, a woman with access, discretion, and old scores in her closet. Some musical, some personal. That makes 3, I said. Where's our 4th violin? Wolfe's eyes rested on the ceiling. Julian Vrana, he said quietly. A young Czech violinist who appears in New York with no lineage, no credentials, and the exact name of a man presumed dead in Lake Garda. A coincidence is one thing, Mr. Goodwin. An echo is another. I knew that tone. Wolfe wasn't finished tuning his theory, but he was already hearing music. It was nearly 10 when Fritz cleared the last of the dishes, and Wolfe, full of veal and reflection, finally allowed himself the indulgence of thought. He leaned back, cupped his brandy glass, and spoke to the room more than to me. Vrana's Revenge, he said, has a metronome. It is slow, it is deliberate, but it is perfectly timed. I waited. He will not kill impulsively, Wolfe continued. He will conduct it, one movement at a time, each act with its own tempo, its own instrument. First, bright, dissonant, and public. Next, he did not finish. I didn't press him. I've learned that when Wolfe leaves a sentence incomplete, it's not because he lacks a conclusion, it's because he's letting the silence speak in its place. I walked to the window. Outside, the city hummed in its usual nocturnal fugue. But inside the brownstone, the rhythm had changed. The first chord had struck, and Wolfe, for all his inertia, had started listening. I knew then this wasn't the finale, it was the overture. And the baton was still moving. I don't make a habit of following violinists, but Julian Vrana walked like a man dragging something behind him, and I wanted to know what it was. He left rehearsal at Carnegie with a case under one arm and a tempo in his step that was more hesitant than hurried, the kind of rhythm that spells caution not convenience. He moved west through the late-day grime of Midtown and turned into a block of buildings that looked like they'd been tuned down a half-step. The walk-up he chose had 3 buzzers and a nameplate that had given up. I let him go in alone, waited a beat, and followed. The top-floor door opened not to Julian, but to Sophie Bellman, robe of cream silk, mouth full of calculation. She didn't seem pleased to see me, but she wasn't shocked either. "Looking for notes or noise, Mr. Goodwin?" "Just checking the harmony," I said. "And the guest list." Julian came to discuss matters of image. You understand, a young man with talent but little presence. The name helps. "What name?" She smiled. "Vrana." I gave it to him. I didn't say anything, but in the space between us the silence began to sound familiar. Sophie gestured toward a lacquered chair but didn't wait for me to take it. Her voice turned crisp, the kind that sharpens when it wants to sell something. "Julian's real surname is unpronounceable," she said. "Or worse, forgettable. He needed a name with resonance. Vrana has gravity in certain circles. Tragedy, mystery, myth." "So you branded him," I said. "I launched him," she corrected. "I paid for his first studio sessions, his wardrobe, his bow, even his vowels." I glanced toward the room behind her, dim and orderly. There was a music stand near the window, a coat slung neatly over the arm of a divan. No signs of chaos, but no sign of Julian either. "Does he know who Anton Vrana was?" "Only what I told him," she said. "A romantic ghost." She met my eyes, and something flickered. She had lied before. The question was when, and how many times. "Be careful, Mr. Goodwin. Some names haunt more than they help." "Only if they've got something left to avenge," I replied. She didn't flinch, but she didn't deny it. Back at the brownstone, I was still digesting Sophie's little operetta when the doorbell rang. I opened it to Leo Torin, smelling faintly of bergamot, sweat, and a motive. He stepped inside without invitation and waved a cream envelope like it was a performance pass. "Just a token of goodwill," he said, handing it to me with 2 fingers and too much charm. "Wolfe doesn't accept tokens," I said. "Or goodwill." Wolfe looked up from his book as Torin entered the office with the grin of a man who thinks flattery is a substitute for truth. He offered no greeting, just placed the envelope on Wolfe's desk. "I'd prefer if the Ruzicka girl's delusions didn't make the papers," he said. Wolfe didn't touch the envelope. "If Miss Ruzicka's condition is delusional," he said, "your concern is medical, not monetary. Why not consult a physician?" Torin's smile slipped. "You misunderstand me." "I rarely do," Wolfe replied. "You insulted the dead, Mr. Torin. Now you propose to pay the living for silence. Neither tactic impresses." I escorted him out before Wolfe did it verbally. He left the envelope behind. Wolfe didn't open it. Fritz burned it with the evening paper. You don't touch Wolfe's orchids. That's not a suggestion, it's doctrine. So when Fritz called me into the plant room with a face like curdled custard, I didn't expect it to be about a broken mist valve. He pointed wordlessly toward the western bench, where Wolfe's prized Miltoniopsis stood arranged in a curved fan. Tucked neatly between 2 pots, almost reverently, was a violin string, gut, waxed, fresh. Wolfe was behind me before I heard him. He stopped just inside the door, took one look and went rigid. His voice, when it came, was lower than usual. "That," he said, "was not there this morning." "No one's been in," Fritz insisted. "No one but me." Wolfe didn't respond. He reached out, took the string with 2 fingers, and dropped it into the wastebasket. "An intrusion," he said, "but not of space, of rhythm." He turned and left the room. I stayed behind and looked at the Miltoniopsis. Petals still perfect, leaves unbruised. Whoever had done it hadn't touched the plants, only the tempo. The next morning, Carla Ruzicka didn't answer her phone. By noon, she wasn't answering her door. By 2, I had a lockpick in my pocket and an uneasy feeling in my gut. Her apartment was empty, not just quiet, emptied. The bed was made, the closet shut, the violin case gone. Sheet music had been left in a neat pile, but none of it recent. I checked with her neighbours. No one had seen her since the night before. I spent the afternoon scouring her haunts, the rehearsal hall, the cafe near Lincoln Center, the bookstore she liked on 58th. Nothing. At 6:15, I found her, or what was left of her composure. She was sitting on a bench in Riverside Park, coat unbuttoned, hair in disarray, half a bottle of cheap red clutched like a lifeline. She didn't look at me when I sat down. "He's punishing us," she said, "one by one, and he won't stop." I didn't ask who. She didn't need to say. Her hands were shaking too hard to play a note. I gave Wolfe the full account, the vanished violin, the park bench confession, the tremor in Carla's fingers. He listened in silence, his eyes fixed not on me, but on the west window where the orchids bloomed in indifference. When I finished, he stood. That, in Wolfian terms, was tantamount to a cavalry charge. He walked to the globe, poured himself 2 fingers of sherry, and sipped once. Then he spoke. "Anton Vrana, if indeed he lives, is not committing acts of revenge. He is conducting them. Each gesture has a musicality. Each victim is a movement. The instrument left in the orchid room, that was not bravado, it was notation." I waited. "He is not merely a killer, he is a composer, and he is nearing the end of his work. What do you want me to do?" He turned slowly. "Call Kramer," he said. "Tell him the crescendo has begun." I made the call. Wolfe returned to his chair. The orchids remained still, but I could have sworn their petals had drawn inward, as if they, too, were bracing for the downbeat. Before midnight, the news came in. Sophie Bellman, found dead in her studio on the Upper West Side. The room had been locked, no sign of forced entry, no valuables taken, only a bow, broken in half and left across her neck, like a curse whispered through horsehair. Kramer called at 12:08 a.m., sounding more hoarse than angry, which for him meant trouble. I relayed the essentials to Wolfe. He didn't ask for repetition. "She had secrets," Wolfe said quietly, "and debts. She was not murdered for what she did, but for what she hid." "Which was?" He closed his eyes. "Likely the truth." I remembered Sophie's face when she said the name Vrana, the way she claimed she'd invented it, as if myth and market were interchangeable. "She knew more than she said," I offered. "Of course she did," Wolfe replied. "She was in the business of saying less." Fritz entered with a fresh pot of coffee. Wolfe ignored it. "3 victims," he murmured. "And a 4th implied. This is no longer vengeance, Mr. Goodwin. It is discipline." He looked at me then, not for opinion, but confirmation. And for once, I didn't have a clever retort, only agreement. By morning, Sophie Bellman's death had ricocheted from the back rooms of the New York Philharmonic to the front pages of half the musical world. One column called it a murder in 4/4 time. Another posed the question, did genius kill genius? If you've never seen critics eulogize one of their own, imagine a pack of bloodhounds suddenly discovering manners and using them as camouflage. From Prague to Vienna, the name Vrana started surfacing again, not whispered, not questioned, but trembled on, as if something once buried had twitched in the dark. Kramer showed up before noon with a cigar clenched, like it owed him money, and a temper with the safety off. He stormed into Wolfe's office and pounded the desk. 3 bodies in 10 days. I'm tired of playing catch-up in a sonata I can't hear." Wolfe didn't rise. He merely adjusted a cushion behind his back. "Inspector," he said, "you are not required to hear the music. Only to notice when the tempo increases." Kramer didn't appreciate the metaphor, but he didn't deny it either. He just left a trail of cigar ash on the floor and stormed back into the homicide fugue. Kramer's next visit was to the rehearsal hall at East 65th, where Carla had spent the evening Sophie was stabbed, tuning and retuning a borrowed Guarneri with 3 other musicians who had no reason to lie and no talent for doing it convincingly. She was brought in anyway, not in cuffs, but not with dignity either, and spent 3 hours in a room full of Kramer's sweat and suspicion. I saw her afterward, standing in the vestibule outside the precinct, coat wrinkled, hands stuffed into her pockets as if trying to hide her fingerprints from the world. "She didn't do it," I said later that evening. "She didn't have to," Wolfe replied. I looked at him. "You think she's lying?" "No," he said. "I think she's remembering." He said it with that irritating certainty of his, the kind that made you want to throw a chair and simultaneously fetch him another beer. I knew that look on Carla. It wasn't guilt. It was the quieter cousin, regret with a deadline. She'd been cleared on paper, but her conscience hadn't caught up yet. And with Wolfe, that was always the more useful evidence. After dinner, Wolfe indulged in a second helping of rhubarb tart and a first helping of speculation. He folded his hands across his considerable circumference and spoke with the certainty of a man not used to being interrupted. "This is not rage, Archie, it is rhythm." "Meaning?" He steepled his fingers. "The killings are not impulsive, they are deliberate, structured, like movements in a symphony. Each victim chosen for their role in a single thematic betrayal." I nodded. "And the conductor?" "Anton Vrana, or someone enthralled to his memory. But this," he tapped the newspaper with 2 fingers just above the article about Sophie, "is not personal vengeance. It is aesthetic retribution. Blood as harmony." I watched him lean back, letting the room settle around his words. He had that look again, the one he gets when he's begun assembling a puzzle, not from its edges, but from the void in the center. Wolfe hated chaos, but this was composed, and that made it infinitely more dangerous. The next morning, I returned from Julian's boarding house with a small, square box and a scribbled note that said, "For the master, as requested." It was a reel-to-reel recording, 22 minutes of solo violin from a chamber performance at Town Hall 2 weeks prior. I threaded it through Wolfe's machine, one of the few electronic devices permitted in the office without protest, and let it play. For the first 2 minutes, he didn't move. At 3, his eyes closed. At 5, they opened, and he raised one finger. I stopped the tape. He didn't speak at first, just reached for his beer, sipped, and set it down as if bracing for a verdict. "That," he said, "is not the hand of Julian Vrana." "Then whose is it?" He looked at me, not with irritation, but with a trace of weariness, as if the answer should have been obvious to anyone not cursed with ordinary perception. "Anton's," he said. "That bowing technique, the aggressive swell in the lower half of the stroke, it was his signature. Too precise to copy, too instinctive to learn." He paused. "Either Julian is Anton or he was taught by him." I didn't argue. I didn't need to, because Wolfe had just heard a ghost. Julian Vrana's immigration records came courtesy of a friend in the Department of Paper and Pretend, a fellow with a nervous smile and a folder that smelled faintly of red tape and anxiety. It was a short file, suspiciously short. According to official ink, Julian arrived 2 years ago from Prague with a student visa, a scholarship, and a passport that had more inconsistencies than a ghost story. His birth certificate had been folded too many times, his university record referenced a conservatory that no longer existed, and his passport, Czech, faded, recently issued, bore a photograph that looked just a few years older than the man himself, and a signature in a hand too clean for someone born into post-war chaos. I'd seen better forgeries on bar receipts. When I returned to the brownstone, Wolfe barely glanced at the folder. He picked up the top sheet, frowned, and let it fall back into the file like a dead leaf into a pond. "Forgery," he said. "But not by a stranger. Someone wanted this young man to exist. And someone else," I added, "wanted him to disappear." Wolfe didn't reply. He was already thinking of the next name on the page. I found Leo Torin in a wine bar near Gramercy, hunched over a glass of something imported and expensive, the kind of drink a man orders when he wants to forget without getting sloppy. He was 2 drinks past careful and 1 short of collapse. When he saw me, he didn't flinch. Just gestured at the chair across from him and muttered, "If you're here to ask about Sophie, ask fast." I didn't. He stared into his drink. She bought the name, Julian bought the lie, and it cost him in blood. Who sold it? He barked a laugh that went nowhere. You can buy names wholesale in this town. History's extra. I leaned in. Did Sophie know Anton was alive? His eyes flicked up, sharp for a moment, then dull again. She didn't need to. She could smell him. I left him with his glass and his regrets. He didn't follow. He'd said what he came to say, whether he meant to or not. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was waiting, and the empty chair in the office had started to mean something. At Wolfe's request, which is not a request but a form of imperial decree, I summoned the necessary suspects for a quiet evening of passive aggression in the office. Leo Torin arrived with the resignation of a man who had already said too much. Sophie, for obvious reasons, was permanently excused. Carla came last, wearing a dark coat and a look like a viola tuned too tightly. Julian did not come. Wolfe did not ask where he was. He simply looked at the chair left vacant and allowed its silence to do the opening argument. "Miss Ruzicka," he said, "you have withheld something." She blinked. "I've told you everything I know." "You've told me everything you can afford to admit," Wolfe said, "but not everything that happened." I was ready to intervene. She looked about 3 seconds from standing, but she didn't. She folded instead, quietly, like parchment. "I saw him," she said. 2 weeks before Bright was killed. Anton. He was older, heavier, but it was him. I wasn't supposed to see him, but I did. "Why didn't you say so?" I asked. "Because he looked at me," she said, and I realized he'd already made the decision. Wolfe didn't respond. He just looked at the empty chair again as if it had just spoken. Julian walked into the precinct just before midnight. Alone, pale, and not dressed for attention, which was a first. Kramer called me 10 minutes later with a voice that sounded like someone trying to be annoyed and failing. "He says he lied," Kramer said. "Not about the murders, about who he is." When I got there, Julian was sitting in the holding room with both hands folded neatly on the table like a schoolboy waiting for a recitation to begin. "I'm not Anton," he said when I entered, "and I didn't kill anyone. But I lied about who I am." "Why?" I asked. "Because he found me first." It wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them, like a verdict already passed. No anger, no fear, just finality. "I played what he taught me," he said, "but he never taught me how to stop." I left the room and didn't look back. Some music ends, some just fades, and Wolfe, I knew, would hear every note. Julian Vrana sat in Wolfe's office like a man who'd just come in from a thunderstorm and was waiting to be handed the towel of forgiveness. He didn't get one. What he got was silence, which from Wolfe is more punishing than thunder. "I lied," Julian said, "but not to harm. I'm not Anton, I'm his son." He didn't pause for effect, which made me half believe it. "He raised me in Austria, privately, quietly. He taught me to play, but never to speak about him, not to anyone. I use the name because he gave it to me." Wolfe tapped the armrest with one finger. "If this is confession, Mr. Vrana, you've chosen the wrong sanctuary. If it is misdirection, it is clumsy." "It's the truth," Julian said. "He trained me. He chose my debut. He even chose my critics. He said I was his revenge." "But not his weapon," Wolfe murmured. Julian shook his head. "I didn't kill them. I didn't want to. I didn't even know he'd come to New York, until it was too late." Wolfe didn't answer. His eyes, half-lidded, said he was listening. But what he was hearing, that was his own symphony. and Julian had only played the first note. Julian Vrana had the haunted look of a man who'd slept beside a ticking bomb and convinced himself it was music. I asked him, gently, which for me means not sarcastically, why he hadn't come forward sooner. He didn't hesitate. He said if I betrayed him, he wouldn't kill me. He'd take my hands. There are threats and there are sentences. That one felt like both. "Do you believe he meant it?" I asked. Julian looked down at his fingers, long and pale, knuckles too thin to be strong, but trained in a discipline that made precision its own brutality. "I've seen what he did to his own," he said. "To students who disappointed him, to critics who doubted him. I was his final performance." "Then why talk now?" I pressed. "Because you're going to find him," he said. "And if I stay silent, you'll think I'm part of it. And if I speak, he might find me first." It wasn't cowardice, it was calculation, the kind you learn when you grow up in the wings of a man who only plays solo. Wolfe heard every word from his chair and said nothing. That was worse. Later that night, after Julian had been escorted to a safe place that even Wolfe begrudgingly approved of, I returned to find the old man poring over a sheaf of newspapers like a scholar digging for blasphemy in a book of psalms. It was Simon Bright's last review, the one that had hung Anton Vrana's ghost in the rafters. Wolfe didn't look up when I came in. He just read aloud, slowly, each syllable pronounced as if it were a small betrayal. "The hand behind the bow has not aged," he quoted, "but it remembers who stole the music." He dropped the page on the desk and leaned back. "It's not a critique," he said. "It's a cipher." I raised a brow. "You think Bright knew?" "I think Bright suspected," Wolfe said. And his language, poetic, dense, almost baroque, was his shield. He didn't name Anton, but he pointed, elegantly. He reached for his beer, but didn't drink. "The man who taught Julian is a purist. He does not forgive. He composes consequences." "Bright was a note in his score?" I asked. Wolfe nodded. "And a loud one." "Too loud." He resumed reading. I didn't interrupt. He was already in movement, too. The retired violin maker lived on a quiet stretch of Long Island where the houses came with hedges and the hedges came with secrets. His name was Amsel, and he had fingers like dried roots and a voice that rasped from the back of his nose. I showed him a photo of Julian. He peered at it, then shook his head. "Not him," he said. "But the other one, he came in March, Czech, accent like gravel, knew exactly what he wanted." "What did he buy?" I asked. "A Bergonzi," he said, with a reverence usually reserved for saints. 18th century, needed a specific timbre, dark but not brooding. I nodded. "Name?" "Initials. A V paid in cash, told me he was recording something private. No labels, no concerts, just preservation." "Do you remember his face?" He hesitated, then nodded slowly. He looked like a man building his own tomb, but making sure the acoustics were perfect. I left with a receipt copy and more than I wanted to know. Back in the car, I called Wolfe. He didn't answer with a hello, just said, "You found him?" I didn't deny it, because we both knew who had played the first note. This time, she didn't leave a note. When Carla vanished before, there had been trails. A door left ajar, a rehearsal cancelled, a cab receipt. This time, there was nothing but destruction and silence. Her apartment had been torn through like someone was looking for a confession hidden under the floorboards. Sheet music lay shredded on the hardwood. Her wardrobe had been ransacked with more violence than curiosity, and the only thing missing, aside from Carla, was her violin. Not just any violin. The one Anton had given her. The bridge from which she'd first played his sonata. The one she never let out of her sight. Gone. I checked with her quartet, her landlord, even the sour-faced neighbour who collected antique plates and grudges. No one had seen her. No one had heard a thing. The lock hadn't been picked, the window wasn't forced. She had either let someone in or never got the chance to say no. When I reported all this to Wolfe, he merely closed his eyes and murmured, "The cadenza, Archie." She was his cadenza. I didn't argue. I knew enough about music to know that the solo doesn't mean survival. Kramer arrived on the scene 2 hours later, sweating like a busted boiler and barking orders at people who weren't listening fast enough. He stood in Carla's living room and glared at the wreckage like it had personally insulted him. "She was our only goddamn link to him," he said, eyes twitching toward the gutted violin case. "Now she's gone, again." I didn't disagree. I just told him what I'd told Wolfe. No signs of forced entry, nothing stolen but the violin, and no Carla. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe hadn't moved from his chair. He hadn't even changed positions. But when I relayed the details, he finally spoke. Quietly, like he didn't want to disturb the dust settling on something old. "He's not finished composing," he said. "This isn't a murder spree, it's a performance." I asked, "So what's the next movement?" He didn't answer, just looked past me into the distance. Sometimes silence is just a pause, and sometimes it's the start of applause you don't want to hear. At 8:43 p.m, Fritz brought the box into the front room with the delicacy usually reserved for pâté en croûte. He set it on the table between Wolfe and me like it might hum. No return address. Brown paper, tied with a rough red cord. Wolfe didn't touch it. He just stared, as if the packaging itself offended him. I opened it. Inside was Carla's violin, or what used to be Carla's violin. The wood had been split along its spine, deliberately, almost surgically. The scroll snapped, the bridge crushed under weight, but it was the message that froze the room. Wrapped around the jagged bridge, secured with a single sliver of gut string, was a strip of ivory cardstock typed in neat block letters. "She won't play for them anymore." Wolfe's nostrils flared. That was as dramatic as he ever got. "He's silencing his own," he said, voice flat. "This was never about enemies. It was about witnesses." I folded the note carefully. "You think she's dead?" "I think," Wolfe said, "she's been made irrelevant." He stood, slowly, with effort. "He's preparing the finale." I didn't ask what that meant, because in Wolfe's world, when the final act begins, there are no more dress rehearsals, only curtain calls. There's a particular kind of silence you get in hospitals, the kind that wraps around you like wet wool and insists on being noticed. Julian Vrana lay in it, unconscious, with one arm in traction and half his face dressed in gauze like he'd offended someone with good aim and poor restraint. The nurse told me he'd been brought in just after dawn, struck by a car that didn't bother to slow down. No witnesses, no plate. Just tire marks and a broken young man. If I'd believed in coincidences, I'd have had to believe this was one. A prodigy laid flat on the pavement hours after a parcel of poetic destruction arrived on Wolfe's doorstep. But I don't believe in coincidences, and Wolfe believes in them even less. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe received the news with a grunt that might have been acknowledgement, or indigestion. Then he closed his eyes and said, "Anton Vrana has chosen to delay his coda, but not indefinitely." Carla's absence, on the other hand, wasn't delaying anything. It was rotting in the silence like a note held too long, trembling before the inevitable snap. Wolfe spent that morning in the company of Strauss and strawberries, the first from Fritz's terrace box, the second from the phonograph. He refused to rise, of course. That would have required physical investment in the material world, which Wolfe avoids with more energy than most men apply to actual labor. But when I relayed the hospital report and suggested we might perhaps be witnessing the tail end of a tragedy, he opened his eyes with a look that told me I'd missed a page. "No," he said. "Not a conclusion, a rest, a suspension. This man, whoever he is beneath the mask, composes with emotional counterpoint. Each death serves not merely vengeance, but form. He tapped a finger on the arm of his chair. The first was a warning, the second, punishment, the third, silence, and now we hover. I asked what came next. He didn't answer immediately. He just muttered, "He is composing a sonata of annihilation. He hears it before we do, but he will want applause." He looked at me then, and his eyes were cold. We must give him a finale and a reason to come hear it. I knew then that the trap wasn't just being set. It was being scored. It's a curious thing, how information, even when false, performs like music in the right hall. Wolfe gave me my cue just after lunch, and by 2:15 I was at the Gazette, whispering in the right ear with the right tone. Carla Varga, presumed missing, had survived, not just survived, recovered. Not just recovered, ready to perform, quietly, at a private evening recital hosted by the notoriously sedentary Nero Wolfe. The story wasn't printed, of course. This wasn't for the masses. It travelled better in smoke and whispers across the rooms where the wrong people always seem to listen better than the right ones. By sundown, I'd heard the rumour repeated back to me twice, once in a cafe where a second-rate violinist passed along a friend's tip, and once from a Met usher who swore Carla had booked a rehearsal hall uptown. She hadn't, of course, but that wasn't the point. Wolfe, when informed of the circulation speed, nodded once. "He will come," he said. "Music may be deception, but he cannot ignore his own motif." Then he closed his eyes again and waited for the music to play him a corpse. Convincing Inspector Kramer to cooperate on Wolfe's little improvisational fantasy was about as easy as selling a trombone to a man with no lips. He showed up at the brownstone fuming, fists like kettle drums and his cigar chewed to a wet, pulpy flag of dissent. "You're telling me," he growled, "you want me to waste my men, my underpaid, overworked, underappreciated men, to babysit your stupid stunt?" Wolfe didn't rise to the bait, or to anything. He simply said, "I want them to observe, not interfere, unless the killer decides to applaud." Kramer muttered something involving orchestras and lunatics, but in the end he gave in. He always does, eventually. Not because Wolfe is charming, he isn't, or persuasive, he is, but it's not the kind you enjoy, but because when Wolfe gets quiet, something loud usually follows. "All right," Kramer said. "We'll post 2 men outside, 1 across the street. But if this blows up in your face—" "It won't," Wolfe said flatly. And for once, I believed him, because when Wolfe calls for silence, he's already hearing the scream beneath it. By 7:30, the brownstone's front room had all the ambience of a drawing room tragedy just waiting for its last cue. Wolfe, enthroned behind his desk like a king presiding over treason, had declined to dress formally, but the atmosphere insisted on its own decorum. Fritz had brewed Darjeeling and produced a platter of Petit's Fours, which, to Wolfe's silent approval, remained untouched, a sure sign the guests were exactly as nervous as they looked. Leo Torrin arrived first with a nervous energy that could have powered a subway car. His tie was crooked, his handshake damp, and he offered his presence like a man serving a subpoena. Next came Julian, delivered by a grey-haired nurse who looked like she could out-arm wrestle a dockhand. Julian's face was pale, eyes guarded, and he offered a nod to no one in particular, least of all Wolfe. The surprise was Horace Yeld, Sophie's former agent. He came in humming tunelessly and announced he was only here to observe. He might as well have carried a flag labelled, "I know something and wish I didn't." But of the man called Vrana, the elder, the myth, the silence behind the bow, there was nothing, officially. Unofficially? Wolfe's eyes told me everything. The music had begun, and someone had arrived on the downbeat. There's a peculiar kind of stillness that takes hold when Wolfe decides it's time. He didn't rise, of course. Movement is for the unresolved. But he shifted in his chair, a subtle recalibration, like a maestro adjusting before the final movement. and interlaced his fingers with the serenity of a man no longer wondering. "I thank you all for your attendance," he said, his voice not loud but indisputably dominant. "Despite the absence of one name on our list, I assure you, everyone essential is present." Julian looked up. Torin blinked. The agent's lips parted in a silent vowel. Wolfe went on. "Some of you have played roles knowingly, others unwittingly, a few tragically. But the composition is clear. The murders were neither spontaneous nor random. They followed a logic, a tempo, a conductor's hand." He turned slightly toward me and said, "Mr. Goodwin, secure the front door." I moved without a word. Wolfe leaned back, and with no triumph, no relish, only gravity, said, "He is already here, and I know who he is." In the space that followed, the room didn't breathe, because every man present had just become the next possible note, and one of them would not be in tune. There's an art to the moment before collapse, the stillness of a structure right before the fault line splits it in half. Wolfe, in that moment, was immovable marble. His voice, however, cut cleanly through the stale air of the office. "I regret the necessity of spectacle," he began, "but it seems the only instrument left to summon the truth." He let that hang, fingers still steepled. Torin sat stiffly at the far end of the room, eyes sharp beneath the veil of rehearsed fatigue. I'd seen hung-over reporters less twitchy. Wolfe turned to him. "Leo Torin is a man without roots, no verifiable family, no past photographs, and, curiously, a suspicious aversion to fingerprints." Torin opened his mouth, then closed it. Wolfe continued, "You are not Leo Torin. You are Anton Vrana. You vanished. You returned. With a different name, a reconstructed face, and a grievance conducted in blood." Julian stiffened. The nurse put a hand on his shoulder. Carla's breath caught, audible and involuntary. Wolfe sat back. "You did not come tonight to listen, Mr. Vrana. You came to finish the symphony." The word murderer was never said. But in that room, it was the only thing heard. There's something obscene about subtlety when it leads to slaughter. Wolfe, naturally, considered it art. He gestured lightly, no more than a twitch of his thick fingers. "It wasn't the face that gave you away, nor the voice. Those, after all, are costumes. But the bow, the bow." Torin, or Vrana, the lines were dissolving, said nothing. Wolfe spoke as if lecturing to a particularly lazy student. Julian's recent rehearsals, they contained a technique nearly extinct in the modern school, a curving pulse at the end of the fourth beat, Anton's mark, not taught, not borrowed, imprinted. He nodded toward Julian, who stared like a man watching his shadow step forward. "You taught him, yes. You raised him in exile. But your own hand, it betrayed you, not in performance, in correction." He turned slightly toward me. "Mr. Goodwin, would you be so obliging as to fetch the metronome?" I didn't move, neither did the accused. Wolfe's smile was wintry. "Ah, but you remember the rhythm, don't you?" A silence followed, the kind only shared by men who hear ghosts bowing behind them. It took me the better part of a day to pry Sophie Bellman's datebook from her agent's office, mostly because the agent insisted she'd died without a single schedule left worth keeping. She hadn't. Wolfe took one look and exhaled like a man served tepid consommé. "Slovenly," he muttered, flipping pages with disdain. "But telling." The notations began neatly, then meandered into panic. The final pages were most instructive, scribbled margins, hastily inked words. One line underlined twice. "Tuesday, Anton, ask about op. 12 variation." I asked, "That handwriting, hers?" "No," Wolfe said, tapping a blocky finger against the page. "His, Anton's. Confirmed?" "Confirmed enough. The habit of writing double S with the upper loop flattened is Czech German in origin. Add the placement of the diacritic above the R in opus. It is not American. It is Anton." "Then she knew?" "She knew." I waited. Wolfe didn't add more. He didn't have to. In Bellman's final days, her calendar hadn't tracked rehearsals or bookings. It had mapped fear. When Wolfe asked me to track violin string orders in the tri-state area, I was prepared for boredom or carpal tunnel. What I found instead was murder's autograph. One order stood out, a single gut-core, wax-finished string, a rare item, mostly ceremonial these days, but brutal in the right hands. The invoice was paid in cash, no return address, but the shipping label, that was gold, a P.O. box 2 blocks from Leo Torrin's apartment. I brought it back like a gift-wrapped confession. Wolfe took it, examined it, and nodded. Once, decisively. "A man does not commit revenge with improvisation," he said. "He prepares. He orders the silence in advance." "And the pseudonym?" I asked. Wolfe's lip curled. "One of Anton's old signatures. He used it once in Prague on a letter to a rival he despised. Was the rival killed? Number merely ruined? It appears age has sharpened his will." Wolfe set the label down gently, as if it might hum. "Tonight, Mr. Goodwin," he said, "we raise the curtain on his finale." You'd think a man who spends his life in silence, shaping spruce and maple for a living, wouldn't have much to say. But Janos Kozinek, retired luthier, was a different species of quiet. His memory didn't need warming up. It came out fully tuned. Yes, a Bergonzi, real, or close enough that he paid like it was, he told me, rubbing a thumb along the rim of a teacup the way others might stroke the belly of a cello. He had a limp, left leg, old, not from birth, military maybe. "What name?" I asked. "Adam Vazelli," he said with a smirk, which is like saying John Smith if you don't want the police to care. And his voice? "Soft," the old man said, but when he said the price, he sounded like someone who used to command silence. He paused, then added, "There was pain, real pain, in his shoulders, not physical. Old rage." Back in the car, I called Wolfe and gave him the name. "It is not a name," Wolfe said. "It's a mask, but even masks leave impressions." And indeed, this one had. The violin Carla had treasured, the one mailed back in half like a relic of some shattered faith, hadn't given up all its secrets. Not until Saul Panzer, meticulous as ever, took a long look at the bridge under high magnification. Wolfe inspected the fingerprint card with a rare flicker of engagement. He didn't touch it, of course, merely observed. And when Fritz brought in a second saucer of coffee without being asked, Wolfe's silence spoke more than a paragraph. "Match confirmed," I told him. "Interpol hit on an old Czechoslovakian passport, issued to one Anton Vrana." Before the fall of 48, Kramer, across from him, shifted like a man being made to sit on his own holster. Wolfe folded his hands and looked at him as though addressing a student who had once scoffed at the value of Latin. "There, Inspector, is your man." The luthier's ghost. The vanished composer. The silent hand behind the bow. "Shall I draw you a map, or will fingerprints suffice?" Kramer didn't answer. He didn't have to. In truth, Wolfe hadn't given him a choice. He had given him an obligation. They brought him in quietly, which is the only way men like Anton Vrana walk anymore, not with chains, but with fatigue. He didn't look broken, just concluded. Kramer began the ritual, but Vrana cut him off. "There is no denial," he said, his voice unflinching. "They took my name, my son, my music. I took something back." Wolfe made a noise, somewhere between a breath and a scoff. "You took lives." Vrana looked at him. "They played my music," he said evenly. "Now they've heard my silence." He didn't resist, he didn't run, and he didn't explain further, but as they turned to lead him out, he added, "A man must leave something behind." I left a silence that fit the crime. I've seen murderers plead, whimper, break, bluff. But Anton Vrana simply folded into the moment, as if he'd practiced it for decades. Wolfe didn't speak again, but I could tell from the stillness in his gaze that this confession hadn't brought him satisfaction. It had brought him symmetry. They found Carla 5 hours later in a defunct music academy down on Varick Street. 3rd floor, windowless, locked from the outside. She was bound gently but firmly to a chair, and the room had been lined in foam and failure. She was alive, dazed, dehydrated, but intact. A doctor said she'd been sedated with something light, probably so she could hear. She had. The walls were lined with speakers. The turntable had one record, Vrana's final work, looping over and over like a lullaby composed for guilt. She hadn't been meant to die. She'd been meant to listen to him, to what he'd become, and to what they'd made of him. Somewhere in the building, someone had scratched for her into the wall with a tuning fork. Wolfe, when I told him, merely said, "So." She was the audience. They escorted him past the service elevator, and I stood near enough to hear the sound before I saw the source. It wasn't a word, it wasn't a cry, it was a whistle. 3 bars, rising, falling, then holding, from the opening of his lost concerto. A melody no one had played in public for 25 years. He didn't look back. He didn't speak. He simply left the note behind, suspended in air, a final phrase hung between dignity and defiance. I didn't say anything to Wolfe, neither did he to me. Some performances don't end. They just leave the hall quieter. Wolfe retreated to the plant rooms the morning after Vrana's final aria with the look of a man allergic to sentiment and oversaturation. He passed through the door with neither word nor glance, leaving me in the office with a phone that wouldn't ring and a memory that wouldn't sit still. I found him half an hour later glowering at a Cymbidium hybrid like it had recited Puccini in falsetto. I suppose, I offered, that murdering violinists inspire less admiration than, say, dispassionate philologists. Wolfe snipped a brown leaf with the precision of a man performing cardiac surgery on arrival. Pfui. Emotional Italians with string instruments. The entire affair was a fugue in indulgence, spiraling toward the inevitable. He turned the pot an inch clockwise, studied it as if daring it to bloom incorrectly, and added, "Revenge is not an art form, it is a vulgarity, especially when it borrows the trappings of composition to excuse bloodletting. I'll be sure to pass that on to the Philharmonic." Wolfe didn't laugh, he just sighed, a long, gusty exhalation as if the whole species had disappointed him again. Then he said, "Archie, bring me the varietal ledger. If humanity must fail, at least let my orchids not follow suit." Inspector Kramer arrived just after noon, wearing a scowl that could have passed inspection at the Navy Yard. He didn't bother with preliminaries, not that Wolfe was ever fond of them. "This time," Kramer said, "you didn't sit on a body, you held a bloody recital." Wolfe, in his chair again and freshly orange-suited, raised one brow. "Inspector, it was no recital, it was a stratagem. You were informed. Your men were posted." Kramer grunted. "You called it bait. You failed to mention it was bait that whistled Chopin and lured in a homicidal tenor with a grudge older than my pension." I offered him a chair, which he ignored. "You got your man," Wolfe said, not a trace of triumph in his tone, which meant he was enjoying it. "Yeah," Kramer muttered. "And you got your damn logic parade." He turned to go, then paused. "Next time you're planning another murder matinee, let me know in advance. I'm getting too old for curtain calls with corpses." Wolfe lifted a hand in what may have been a farewell or a flick at a fly. "Duly noted," he said. "But you'll admit, musically, the ending held." Carla didn't come to say goodbye, and I didn't blame her. Some exits don't belong to conversation, they belong to silence, and she had earned hers. Her building super told me she'd vacated the apartment with no forwarding address. The piano remained, closed and covered. The music stand had been taken, the violin case was gone too, but only the case. The instrument itself, he said, she left behind. It lay on the top shelf of her bedroom closet, neatly swaddled in velvet and tissue, like a relic in exile. The strings had been cut, not torn, but clipped, deliberately, gently. I asked Wolfe if he wanted it sent to her. "No," he said, without looking up from his book. "She has made a choice." To return it would be to deny her the courage of it. She could have had a career. Wolfe's finger marked his place. So might have Orestes, but some melodies are too soaked in grief to play again. He returned to the page. In the end, her silence was louder than any ovation, and more honest than applause. I found him in Montreal, 3 blocks from the old quarter, going by the name Jean-Louis Perrault. The café was small, the coffee strong, and he looked older than the week since we last saw him could explain. He smiled when he saw me. Not warmly. More like a man checking to see if the past had followed him through customs. "I guessed you'd find me," he said. "I suppose Wolfe just deduced?" "Wolfe doesn't guess, and I don't miss return addresses," I told him. He offered me a seat. I didn't take it. "I'm not here to drag you back," I said, "just to close the circle." Julian nodded. "He taught me to play," he said after a while. "Eyes not on me, but somewhere left of memory. But not how to stop." "I being Vrana?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The table between us held nothing. No contract, no photograph, not even sugar. "Are you going to keep playing?" Julian looked at his hands. "No," he said quietly. "Not for an audience, not for a stage." He didn't ask if Carla was all right. Maybe he already knew. Or maybe silence, once inherited, becomes a second language. Wolfe does not wax philosophical over lunch. He reserves that privilege for orchid cuttings and mass murderers with operatic tendencies. But that day, over squab with celeriac and a chilled Moselle, he made an exception, or more accurately, he made a performance of restraint. Anton Vrana, he said between bites, was not so much a criminal as a composer who mistook grievance for genius. I allowed myself a small nod, and composed his opus in the key of homicide. He made a face. "Please, spare me the crass metaphors. This was no sonata. It was a fugue, dense and recursive, devouring its own theme. Revenge, disguised as order, is no more noble than a tantrum dressed in uniform." I reached for the bread basket. "Still, you have to admit, as vendettas go, it had flavour, passion, percussion," he grunted. "Passion is for youth. Percussion is for marching bands. Justice, Mr. Goodwin, is neither percussive nor passionate. It is cold. It is final. It does not perform." I poured him more wine. "How about we let Strauss do the performing?" He inclined his head. "Duck and Strauss, acceptable, but no Mahler, and—" He held up a finger. "God help you if I hear another violin." The mood lightened. Slightly, but not enough to forget what had echoed. We settled, by mutual détente, on Strauss, Richard, not Johann, and a recording that, Wolfe assured me, featured minimal string arrangements. He took his seat in the office as though the room had sinned by existing and needed his corrective presence to balance it out. "I am placing a temporary embargo," he declared, "on all bowed instruments. Their symbolism has exhausted its welcome." "Understood," I said, leaning back with my coffee. "Shall I alert the Philharmonic?" "Spare me." The mood, though lifted by duck and the promise of a quiet afternoon, still held a tautness around its edges, the kind that arrives when justice is done, but satisfaction is deferred. Wolfe closed his eyes. "A violin, Mr. Goodwin, once lifted the soul of man. Today it has dragged it into a cellar and locked the door. Let it rest." I was inclined to agree. We'd heard enough bowing, scraping, tuning, and dissonant silence to score a requiem, at least for a week. Outside, the traffic had resumed its indifferent tempo, but inside, for once, the brownstone remained perfectly, elegantly out of tune. As dusk settled over West 35th Street like a velvet curtain lowered with purpose, I found myself in the office, alone, drink in hand, the ice clinking faintly like memory, tapping at the edge of thought. Wolfe had retreated to the plant rooms again, citing fatigue, digestion, or, more likely, the accumulated distaste of having been too right, too soon. The case was closed. Carla had disappeared into silence. Julian had vanished into another name, and Anton Vrana, or what remained of him, was now property of the state. Yet the air still carried a dissonance, faint and unresolved. The brownstone was quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't soothe, but asks. I watched the last of the sunlight stripe the sidewalk like bars on a muted scale. We had all played our parts. Wolfe the conductor, me the errant brass section, and the suspects a tragic string ensemble unravelling by the measure. No one clapped, no one bowed, but something lingered under it all. Not a sound, a presence, like a final note too soft to register, but too true to forget. I lifted my glass. To the silence that remains when music ends, and to the truths that, like certain melodies, never fully resolve. Some crimes sing softly before they strike, in minor keys and half-forgotten refrains. And some men, like Anton Vrana, compose not with art, but with absence, leaving behind no symphony, only silence. Justice, in Wolfe's parlour, came not with handcuffs, but with a quiet knowing, the kind that weighs heavier than guilt alone. But in the hush that followed, as Carla stepped away from her music and Julian vanished into another name, one question lingered like a final chord, unresolved. Can revenge ever truly end, or does it simply change its tune? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes.